You think a pretty little thing like you can teach us anything? The words echoed through Riverside Community College's art studio as Troy Brennan, 6 feet 3 inches of arrogant muscle, towered over the petite instructor during her very first roll call. His linebacker frame cast a shadow across her desk, while his crew of fellow football players snickered behind him. "Why don't you go back to making coffee for the real teachers?" The 26-year-old woman standing before them appeared defenseless, soft-spoken, barely 5'4", with gentle features that screamed vulnerability to these predators. They saw an easy target, someone they could break within days. What they couldn't see was the 15 years of Wing Chun mastery flowing through her deceptively calm exterior, or the steel-hard determination forged in Chicago's underground fighting circuits. What they were about to discover would shatter their understanding of strength, respect, and the devastating consequences of underestimating the quiet ones. We've all met people who judge others by appearance alone, haven't we? And we've probably all wondered what would happen if someone finally stood their ground. Well, what happened next in that Texas classroom might surprise you more than you think. Riverside Community College sat nestled in the heart of Millbrook, Texas, a town where Friday night football reigned supreme, and questioning the local heroes was tantamount to treason. The August heat shimmered off the parking lot asphalt as 26-year-old Cassidy Harper pulled her modest Honda Civic into the faculty parking space marked Art Department. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. Not from fear, but from the familiar pre-fight energy that had served her well in Chicago's most brutal training sessions. This was supposed to be her fresh start. After 8 years of teaching in Chicago's toughest neighborhoods, she'd accepted the position at Riverside, hoping for a quieter life, to a chance to focus on her art without worrying about metal detectors and gang colors. Her master's degree in fine arts from Northwestern, combined with her teaching credentials, had made her the perfect candidate for their new digital design and visual arts program. What her resume didn't mention was the other education she'd received: 15 years of Wing Chun training under Sifu Chen Wei, one of Chicago's most respected martial arts instructors. Cassidy had started training at 11 after a particularly brutal incident with neighborhood bullies left her with a broken nose and a determination never to be helpless again. While other girls her age were at dance classes, she was learning the ancient Chinese art of close-quarters combat. Wing Chun wasn't about size or strength, it was about speed, precision, and using an opponent's force against them, perfect for someone who would never intimidate anyone with physical presence alone. The art building buzzed with pre-semester energy as students hurried past her. Most barely glanced her way, just another young teacher trying to make it in academia. She'd deliberately dressed down for her first day, simple navy slacks, a modest blouse, and minimal makeup. In Chicago, she'd learned that looking too professional could make you a target. Here in Texas, she hoped blending in would buy her time to establish herself before any challenges arose. That hope died the moment she walked into Studio B. Troy Brennan held court at the back of the room like a king, surveying his domain. At 21, he was older than most community college students, having spent 2 years trying to make it at University of Texas before academic failures and an assault charge brought him back home. His father owned 3 car dealerships across 2 counties, making the Brennan name synonymous with money and influence in Millbrook. Troy wore that privilege like armor, his Rolex catching the fluorescent lights as he gestured dismissively at something on his phone. Flanking him were his loyal lieutenants, Jake Morrison, the sheriff's nephew whose father coached high school football, and Brett Collins, whose family had been funding the college's athletics program for 3 generations. Together, they formed Millbrook's unofficial royalty, young men who'd never faced real consequences for their actions and saw the world as their personal playground. The rest of the 23 students in Cassidy's Introduction to Digital Design course formed a careful hierarchy around these 3. Some were genuinely interested in learning graphic design skills for future careers. Others, like Maria Santos and Kevin Patel, were there because it satisfied an art requirement and seemed easier than oil painting. A few, including Sarah Mitchell, a quiet girl with artistic talent, had enrolled specifically because they'd heard the new teacher was young and might actually understand modern design. As Cassidy arranged her materials at the front desk, she could feel the assessment happening behind her. Students were sizing her up. determining where she fit in their social ecosystem. In a community college setting, respect wasn't automatically granted to instructors. It had to be earned, especially from students who saw themselves as temporarily slumming it before moving on to bigger things. "All right, everyone, let's get started," Cassidy said, her voice carrying clearly through the room despite its gentle tone. She'd learned in Chicago that projecting calm confidence was often more effective than shouting. "Welcome to Introduction to Digital Design. I'm Miss Harper, and over the next semester, we're going to explore how visual communication shapes our world." Most students settled into their seats, but Troy remained standing, his arms crossed as he looked her up and down with obvious disdain. "How old are you anyway?" he called out, not bothering to raise his hand. "You look like you just graduated yourself." A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. Cassidy had expected this challenge. It always came early, usually from someone trying to establish dominance. "I'm 26, and I have 8 years of teaching experience, along with a master's degree from Northwestern," she replied evenly. "But more importantly, I'm here to help you develop skills that will serve you in whatever career path you choose." "Northwestern," Troy repeated mockingly, finally taking his seat but sprawling across it with deliberate disrespect. "Bet they didn't teach you much about the real world out there in your fancy college bubble." Cassidy felt the familiar tingle in her fingertips that always preceded conflict. In Chicago, she'd learned to read the signs, the way Troy's shoulders were set, the challenge in his eyes, the positioning of his friends for maximum social impact. This wasn't just teenage rebellion, it was a calculated test of her authority, probably planned before she'd even walked in. "You're right," she said, surprising him with her agreement. "College doesn't teach you everything about the real world. That's why I also spent 8 years working in Chicago public schools, where I learned that respect is earned through actions, not assumptions." She turned to the whiteboard and began writing the course objectives, deliberately turning her back on Troy to show she wasn't intimidated. Behind her, she heard him whisper something to Jake that made both boys snicker. The sound triggered memories of every bully she'd ever faced, but also of every technique Sifu Chen had drilled into her muscle memory. "Let's start with roll call," she said, picking up her tablet. "When I call your name, please tell me one thing you hope to learn in this class." The first few students responded normally. Career goals, software skills, portfolio development. The atmosphere began to settle into typical classroom routine until she reached Troy's name, Troy Brennan. He leaned back in his chair, balancing it on 2 legs in a display of casual disregard for basic rules. "Here," he drawled, "and what I hope to learn is whether you're actually qualified to teach us anything, or if Daddy got you this job." The room went dead silent. Even students who'd been whispering stopped to watch what would happen next. This was the moment that would define Cassidy's entire semester. How she handled this challenge would determine whether she could maintain classroom control or become another casualty of Troy Brennan's reign of terror. In her peripheral vision, Cassidy noticed Sarah Mitchell sitting forward slightly, as if hoping someone would finally stand up to Troy. Maria Santos had her eyes fixed on her desk, clearly uncomfortable, but too afraid to speak up. The dynamic was achingly familiar. A small group of bullies controlling an entire environment through fear and intimidation, while everyone else suffered in silence. "Mr. Brennan," Cassidy said calmly, setting down her tablet and facing him directly. "Your registration paperwork indicates you're here because this course is required for your business degree. What I hope you'll learn is how visual communication can enhance whatever career path you choose after graduation." "Cute answer," Troy replied, letting his chair drop forward with a loud thunk. "But you didn't address my question." "See, my dad donates a lot of money to this school, and he's wondering if they're actually hiring qualified teachers or just pretty faces to keep enrollment up." Jake Morrison snorted with laughter. "Yeah. Miss Harper, maybe you should tell us about your real qualifications instead of just reading from a script." The comment revealed their strategy: undermine her authority through personal attacks while maintaining a veneer of academic questioning. It was sophisticated bullying, the kind that would be hard to prove to administrators while being devastatingly effective in destroying classroom dynamics. Cassidy felt her center shift subtly, her weight distributing evenly across both feet in a stance that looked casual but could explode into movement in milliseconds. 15 years of training had taught her that the best fighters often didn't look like fighters at all. My qualifications include 8 years teaching in some of Chicago's most challenging schools, she said, her voice maintaining its gentle tone while her eyes locked onto Troy's with unwavering intensity. I've worked with students who faced real problems, gang pressure, poverty, family violence. What I learned is that sometimes the loudest voices in the room are compensating for something they don't want others to see. The observation hit its mark. Troy's confident smirk faltered slightly as he processed the implication. She hadn't risen to his bait or gotten defensive. Instead, she'd redirected the conversation to expose his tactics. "Are you saying I'm compensating for something?" he asked, his voice gaining an edge that suggested the gloves were coming off. "I'm saying that students who are genuinely interested in learning ask different kinds of questions," Cassidy replied. "But if you'd like to continue this conversation, we can schedule a private meeting during my office hours. Right now, I'd like to continue with roll call so we can get started with actual course content." It was a masterful deflection. She'd offered him a face-saving exit while making it clear she wouldn't be intimidated. Troy stared at her for a long moment, clearly calculating his next move. His friends waited for his signal, ready to escalate or back down based on his decision. "Nah," he said finally, leaning back again. "I think we're good. For now." The threat in those last words was unmistakable. But Cassidy continued with roll call as if nothing had happened. When she reached Sarah Mitchell's name, the quiet girl spoke up clearly. "I hope to learn how to create designs that tell stories." Her eyes met Cassidy's briefly, and there was gratitude there. Someone had finally not backed down from Troy. By the time class officially began, the dynamic had been established. Troy and his crew would test boundaries, but Cassidy had shown she wouldn't crumble at the first challenge. Still, she knew this was just the opening round in what would likely be a semester-long campaign. "Today we're going to start with a fundamental question," she said, pulling up a presentation on the smartboard. "How do images communicate messages without words?" She clicked to the first slide, a powerful photograph of a civil rights protest from the 1960s. This image was taken in 1963 during the March on Washington. Without reading any caption, what message does it convey? Hands slowly went up around the room. Students began engaging with the material, analyzing composition, emotional impact, and historical context. Even some of Troy's followers seemed genuinely interested in the discussion, but Troy himself remained conspicuously silent, scrolling through his phone with deliberate disrespect. When Cassidy called on him directly to answer a question about visual symbolism, he didn't even look up. "Sorry, were you talking to me?" he asked with mock surprise. "I was checking some important messages." "Yes. I was asking for your thoughts on how composition affects emotional response in visual media." Troy made a show of looking at the screen for the first time. "Honestly, I think you're overthinking it. A picture's a picture. If people want to see racism everywhere, they will. If they want to see progress, they'll see that instead. It's all about what agenda you're pushing." The comment was designed to derail the academic discussion and inject controversy. Several students shifted uncomfortably. While others nodded in agreement, Cassidy recognized the tactic: force the teacher to either engage in a political debate or appear to suppress differing viewpoints. "That's an interesting perspective," she said neutrally, "and it actually supports our main point, that viewers bring their own experiences and biases to every image they see. The designer's job is to understand how those factors influence interpretation." She'd acknowledged his viewpoint without endorsing it, then redirected back to the educational objective. It was a professional handling of a deliberately provocative comment. But Troy's expression suggested he wasn't satisfied with her response. As the class progressed, his disruptions became more frequent and creative. He would start side conversations just loud enough to be distracting. He'd ask deliberately obtuse questions designed to waste time. When Cassidy demonstrated software techniques, he'd loudly complain that his computer wasn't working properly, forcing her to come help him while he made comments about her appearance. "Thanks for the personal attention," he said when she leaned over to adjust his monitor settings. "I can see why they hired you for this job." The implication was clear and inappropriate, but it was delivered just quietly enough that other students might not have heard. Cassidy straightened without responding, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In Chicago, she dealt with far worse. But the setting made this different. Here, Troy held social power that could complicate any official complaint she might file. The class period ended with most students genuinely engaged in the assignment, creating a visual composition that conveyed emotion without using text. They would present their work in the next session, and Cassidy found herself looking forward to seeing their creativity. As students packed up their materials, Troy made sure to be the last one to leave. He approached her desk where she was organizing her papers, his imposing frame designed to intimidate. "Nice class, Miss Harper," he said, his tone friendly but his eyes cold. "I think we're going to have an interesting semester together." "I hope so," she replied, not looking up from her work. "Education should be engaging." "Oh, it will be," he promised. "I have a feeling you're going to learn a lot about how things work around here." He left without another word. But the threat hung in the air like smoke. Cassidy finished packing her materials methodically, her outward calm masking the storm building inside. She'd faced down gang members and drug dealers in Chicago. But this felt different, more personal, more calculated. As she walked to her car, she noticed Sarah Mitchell waiting by the building entrance, clearly wanting to talk but nervous about approaching. "Miss Harper," the girl called out tentatively, "I just wanted to say that was a really good class. I learned more in 50 minutes than I did in my entire high school art program." "Thank you, Sarah. I'm looking forward to seeing what you create for the next assignment." Sarah hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "You should know that, Troy. He's going to make things difficult. He's done it to other teachers before, but most of us really want to learn, and we're glad you're here." The warning was delivered with genuine concern, and Cassidy felt a surge of appreciation for this brave young woman who was willing to speak up. "I appreciate that, Sarah, and I want you to know that this classroom is going to be a safe space for everyone who's here to learn. I don't give up easily." Sarah smiled for the first time since class began. "Good. We need someone who won't back down." As Cassidy drove home to her small apartment, she reflected on the day's events. The first battle had been fought, and while she'd held her ground, she knew Troy would escalate. His type always did when initial intimidation tactics failed. That evening, she called her old mentor in Chicago. "Sifu Chen, it's Cassidy. I might need some advice." The second week of classes brought a subtle but noticeable shift in dynamics. Word had spread through Millbrook's tight social network that the new art teacher had faced down Troy Brennan and lived to tell about it. Some faculty members stopped by her office to introduce themselves and offer support. They'd heard about the classroom incident through the student grapevine and were curious about this newcomer who hadn't immediately capitulated to local pressure. But Troy wasn't done. If anything, the fact that his initial dominance display had failed only made him more determined to establish control. He began arriving to class early, using the time to position himself strategically and rally his supporters. Jake Morrison and Brett Collins flanked him like a presidential security detail, while newer recruits sought his approval through increasingly disruptive behavior. "Morning, Miss Harper," Troy would say with exaggerated politeness as she entered the studio. "Ready for another educational experience?" The double meaning wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Other students would tense up, knowing that Troy's fake courtesy was usually a prelude to worse behavior. Sarah Mitchell had taken to sitting in the front row, as far from Troy's influence as possible, while Maria Santos looked increasingly uncomfortable as the social pressure mounted. Cassidy's strategy remained consistent, professional, calm, and focused on education rather than personal conflicts. When Troy made sarcastic comments about assignments being too elementary, she would redirect by asking him to suggest more challenging alternatives. When he disrupted group discussions with off-topic remarks, she would acknowledge his input briefly before steering back to the lesson objectives. But Troy was learning too. He was studying her responses, looking for cracks in her composure, testing different approaches to find her breaking point. And he was getting creative. During the third week, students were scheduled to present their emotion without words, visual compositions. Sarah Mitchell had created a powerful piece about isolation that used negative space and shadow to convey loneliness. Kevin Patel had designed a composition about family connection that incorporated cultural symbols from his Indian heritage. Even some of Troy's followers had produced thoughtful work that demonstrated genuine engagement with the concepts. When Troy's turn came, he stood up with his laptop and connected it to the projection system with theatrical flair. "My piece is called Authority Questioned," he announced, clicking to his first slide. The image that appeared made several students gasp. Troy had created a digital manipulation that showed a female figure, bearing an unmistakable resemblance to Cassidy, being crushed by oversized letters spelling "unqualified." The composition was technically proficient but clearly designed to humiliate rather than educate. "The emotion I'm conveying," Troy continued with mock seriousness, "is the feeling of inadequacy when someone is placed in a position they haven't earned through merit." The room went dead silent. This was no longer subtle disruption. It was a direct, public attack designed to undermine Cassidy's authority in front of the entire class. Every student was watching to see how she would respond. Cassidy felt the familiar energy building in her core, the same sensation she'd experienced countless times before sparring sessions, but instead of moving into a fighting stance, she channeled that energy into perfect stillness. "That's an interesting interpretation of the assignment," she said calmly, as if Troy had presented a standard academic project. "Can you explain your choice of color palette and how it supports your emotional message?" Troy blinked, clearly thrown by her failure to react emotionally. He'd expected anger, embarrassment, or defensiveness, any response that would give him more ammunition for future attacks. Well, I use darker colors to represent uncertainty," he improvised, realizing that his attack had failed to land. "And the typography choices?" Cassidy continued, treating his presentation with the same analytical approach she'd given every other student. Troy stumbled through an explanation of his font selections, growing increasingly uncomfortable as Cassidy dissected his work purely from a design perspective. By the time she finished her critique, he'd been forced to defend artistic choices he'd made solely for shock value, and the result was academically embarrassing. "Thank you for sharing your work," she concluded. "For next time, I'd encourage you to consider how personal bias might limit creative exploration. The strongest designs often come from pushing beyond our initial emotional reactions." The gentle criticism stung worse than any angry response would have. Troy had thrown his best punch, and Cassidy had absorbed it completely, then turned it into a teaching moment. He slumped back into his seat, his confidence visibly shaken. But if Cassidy thought that would end the escalation, she was mistaken. Troy's public failure only made him more dangerous. Over the next week, his tactics shifted from classroom disruption to more sophisticated psychological warfare. He began recruiting allies from outside the class. Football players started showing up during her office hours, not to ask about coursework but to check out the new teacher. With barely concealed hostility, they would crowd into her small office space, making comments about how cozy it was and asking if she felt safe working so late. Troy also started spreading rumors through the college's social networks. He claimed she was too young and inexperienced for the position, that she'd only been hired because of affirmative action policies, that she was mentally unstable from her time in Chicago's war zone schools. The whispers followed her through faculty meetings and lunch breaks. Most insidiously, he began documenting everything she did with his phone, claiming he wanted to protect himself from false accusations. He would record her classroom explanations and then share edited clips that made her seem incompetent or biased. When she asked him to put the phone away, he would refuse, citing his right to protect himself from discrimination. The campaign was working. Cassidy noticed other faculty members treating her differently, some offering awkward sympathy while others maintained polite distance. The department chair, Dr. Williams, called her in for a check-in meeting that felt more like an interrogation about her teaching methods and classroom management skills. "I've heard there have been some challenges with student engagement," Dr. Williams said carefully. "Perhaps we should discuss strategies for building rapport with our local student population." The subtext was clear. Troy's family's money and social connections carried weight, and Cassidy was expected to find a way to accommodate his behavior rather than confront it. The institution's priority was avoiding conflict with influential donors, not supporting faculty members who stood up to bullying. That night, alone in her apartment, Cassidy finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the situation. This wasn't like Chicago, where institutional support existed, even if it was limited. Here, she was isolated, facing not just student bullying but systemic pressure to conform to local power structures. She stood before the full-length mirror in her bedroom and began running through Wing Chun forms, letting muscle memory guide her through the precise movements her body had learned over 15 years of training. The ancient patterns were meditative, each gesture flowing into the next with economical grace. Siu Nim Tao, the first form, teaching centerline theory and proper stance. Her hands moved in small, precise circles, deflecting imaginary attacks while maintaining perfect balance. Chun Q, the second form, introducing stepping and bridging techniques. She practiced the signature movements that allowed a smaller fighter to get inside a larger opponent's reach, turning size disadvantage into strategic opportunity. Bu Ji, the third form. For emergency techniques when normal defenses had failed, these were the movements that could end a fight in seconds. The last resort, when all other options were exhausted. As she moved through the forms, Cassidy felt her center returning. The political pressures and social manipulation tactics couldn't touch the core of who she was, someone who had faced real violence and learned not just to survive, but to protect others who couldn't protect themselves. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Having fun yet? This is just the beginning. Cassidy looked at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. But she made a mental note to document everything. If Troy wanted to escalate this into a war, she would be ready. The next morning brought a new challenge. Cassidy arrived at her classroom to find offensive graffiti scrawled across her whiteboard, crude drawings and words, questioning her competence and character. Cleaning it off took 20 minutes, making her late for the start of class. Troy was already in his seat when students began arriving, his expression innocent, but his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Oh wow, Miss Harper," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Somebody really doesn't like you. That's terrible. Vandalism is a serious offense." Cassidy replied calmly as she finished erasing the last of the graffiti. "I'll be reporting this to campus security." "Good idea." Troy agreed with fake concern. "You should definitely find out who would do such a thing. Could be anyone, really. Lots of people have opinions about lots of things." The threat was carefully worded but unmistakable. Troy was letting her know that he had support, that the attacks could come from any direction, and that she was increasingly isolated. But as Cassidy looked around the room, she saw something that gave her hope. Sarah Mitchell was staring at Troy with obvious disgust. Kevin Patel was shaking his head in disapproval. Even some of Troy's usual supporters looked uncomfortable with this escalation. Maria Santos, who had barely spoken all semester, suddenly stood up. "This is wrong," she said quietly, her voice shaking but determined. "Miss Harper is a good teacher. She doesn't deserve this." The simple statement of support electrified the room. For the first time, someone had publicly contradicted Troy's narrative. Other students began nodding in agreement, and Cassidy felt a shift in the social dynamics. Troy's face flushed red. He wasn't used to being challenged by someone from his own demographic. Maria came from a family with local standing, and her opinion carried social weight. "Nobody asked you." "Maria," he snapped, his carefully maintained facade cracking. "And nobody asked you to make everyone miserable." She shot back, surprising herself with her own boldness. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of campus security, who had come to investigate the vandalism report. As the officer took photos and asked questions, Troy maintained his innocent act. But the officer seemed skeptical of his claims to know nothing about the incident. After security left, Cassidy continued with the planned lesson. But the atmosphere had changed. For the first time since the semester began, Troy's dominance was being questioned by his own peer group. The united front he'd carefully constructed was showing cracks, but Cassidy knew this wouldn't end the conflict. It would only make Troy more desperate and dangerous. A cornered bully was the most unpredictable kind, and she could feel the situation building toward an inevitable confrontation. That confrontation would come sooner than she expected, and when it did, 15 years of Wing Chun training would finally meet the moment she'd been preparing for her entire adult life. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon in early October. Cassidy had just finished explaining the principles of color theory when Troy stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent studio. "I'm tired of pretending this amateur hour class is worth my time." Every student froze. This wasn't his usual subtle disruption. Something had snapped in Troy's carefully maintained facade. His face was flushed, his fists clenched at his sides. "Mr. Brennan, please take your seat," Cassidy said calmly. But her body was already shifting into readiness. Weight balanced, breathing controlled. "Don't tell me what to do," Troy snarled, taking a step toward her desk. "You think you're so smart with your fancy degree and your big city attitude? This is Texas. Lady, we don't need some outsider telling us how to think." Jake Morrison and Brett Collins exchanged nervous glances. Even they seemed unprepared for this level of escalation. The other students pressed back in their chairs, instinctively creating distance from what felt like impending violence. "Troy, stop," Maria Santos said firmly, standing up from her seat. "You're embarrassing yourself." Troy whirled around to face her, his eyes blazing with fury. "Shut up. Maria, this doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us," Sarah Mitchell said quietly, also rising from her chair. "Miss Harper is a good teacher, and you're acting like a child." More students began standing. Kevin Patel. Then 2 others. Then 3 more. A quiet rebellion was forming, and Troy could feel his kingdom crumbling around him. "Fine," he said, turning back to Cassidy with dangerous intensity. "You want to be the teacher? Let's see how tough you really are." He started walking toward her, his imposing 6'3" frame radiating menace. In that moment, every eye in the room was focused on the 5'4" woman behind the desk, waiting to see if she would run, call for help, or somehow stand her ground against someone twice her size. Cassidy stepped out from behind her desk, moving with fluid grace that seemed almost casual to untrained observers, but 15 years of Wing Chun had taught her to read bodies like books, and Troy's body was screaming aggression, the forward lean, the bunched shoulders, the clenched fists telegraphing his intentions. "Mr. Brennan, you need to stop right there," she said, her voice steady, but carrying a new authority that made several students lean forward in recognition. "Or what?" Troy demanded, now only 3 feet away and still advancing. "You'll call security? You'll report me to Daddy Williams? Face it, lady, you've got no power here." He reached out to shove her, just as he'd done to countless other victims over the years. It was his signature move, the physical assertion of dominance that had always worked before, but Cassidy wasn't there anymore. In one flowing motion, she had sidestepped his advance, using Wing Chun's signature centerline theory, deflected his outstretched hands with a subtle packsaw technique, and positioned herself at an angle where his size advantage meant nothing. To observers, it looked like Troy had simply missed his target, but he felt the controlled power in her redirection. "What the?" he started to say, spinning around to face her again. This time he came at her with both hands, trying to grab her shoulders and intimidate her through sheer physical presence. Again, Cassidy seemed to simply flow around his attack, using a combination of bong saw and tan saw techniques to neutralize his reach while maintaining perfect balance. Troy stumbled forward, off balance and confused. He'd thrown what should have been overwhelming force at a tiny target, only to find himself grasping air while she remained perfectly composed. "How are you doing that?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly, with the first hint of uncertainty. The students were riveted. They'd never seen anything like this graceful demonstration of controlled movement. Sarah Mitchell had her phone out, recording what would later become legendary footage in Millbrook social media circles. Troy's face was turning red with embarrassment and rage. Being outmaneuvered by someone half his size in front of his peers was the ultimate humiliation. He charged at her one more time, this time with genuine violence in his eyes. Cassidy's training took over completely. As Troy lunged forward, she used a classic Wing Chun Bilji technique, not to hurt him, but to redirect his momentum while applying just enough pressure to a nerve point that his legs buckled. He found himself on one knee, his right arm gently but firmly controlled by her seemingly delicate hands. "I think," Cassidy said quietly, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent room, "that's enough demonstration for today." Troy tried to pull away and found he couldn't. Somehow, this petite woman had achieved complete control over his much larger frame, using nothing but precise positioning and leverage. The harder he struggled, the more uncomfortable his position became. "Let me go," he gasped, finally understanding that he was completely outmatched. "Are you going to return to your seat and behave appropriately?" Cassidy asked calmly. Troy nodded frantically. All his earlier bravado evaporated. Cassidy released him with the same fluid grace she'd shown throughout the encounter, and he scrambled back to his chair like a scolded child. The room erupted in whispers and amazed conversations. Jake Morrison and Brett Collins stared at their fallen leader with obvious shock. Maria Santos was grinning broadly, while Sarah Mitchell looked like she'd just witnessed a superhero movie come to life. "Now then," Cassidy said, smoothing her blouse and returning to her lesson as if nothing unusual had happened. "As I was saying about complementary color relationships," but no one was thinking about color theory anymore. Word of the confrontation spread through Millbrook Community College like wildfire. By the end of the day, the story had reached mythical proportions. The tiny art teacher who'd taken down the campus bully without throwing a single punch. Troy never returned to class. Within a week, his father quietly withdrew him from the college, citing better opportunities elsewhere. Jake Morrison and Brett Collins suddenly became model students, completing assignments without complaint and treating Cassidy with obvious respect. The transformation in classroom dynamics was immediate and profound. Students who had been afraid to participate began sharing their ideas freely. Creative projects became more ambitious and personal. Sarah Mitchell's confidence blossomed as she took on leadership roles in group discussions. 6 months later, Cassidy's digital design program had become one of the most popular courses at the college. Students from other departments were trying to transfer in, drawn by stories of the teacher who had created a genuinely safe learning environment through a combination of professional competence and quiet strength. During the final class of the semester, Maria Santos approached Cassidy's desk with a carefully wrapped package. "This is from all of us," she said shyly. "We wanted to thank you for, well, for everything." Inside was a framed collage created by the entire class, dozens of small designs that, when viewed together, spelled out, "Strength comes in all sizes." In the corner, someone had written, "Thank you for teaching us that standing up for what's right never goes out of style." Cassidy felt tears prick her eyes as she looked around the room at faces that had transformed from fearful and guarded to confident and creative. These students had learned far more than graphic design principles. They'd discovered their own voices and the courage to use them. "Thank you," she said simply. "All of you. This has been the most rewarding semester of my teaching career." As students filed out for the last time, Sarah Mitchell lingered behind. "Miss Harper," she said quietly, "I start at UT Austin next fall, majoring in graphic design. I never would have had the confidence to apply if you hadn't shown me what was possible. You had that strength all along. Sarah, I just helped you recognize it." That evening, as Cassidy packed up her classroom for summer break, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd come to Texas seeking a quiet life and instead found herself at the center of a battle against institutional bullying. But in standing her ground, she'd discovered something powerful, that sometimes the most effective way to fight violence isn't with more violence, but with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sifu Chen. "Heard through the grapevine about your Texas adventure. Proud of you. Student, you used your training exactly as intended, to protect others and yourself without causing harm." Cassidy smiled, thinking about all the students who would enter her classroom in future semesters. Some would come as bullies, testing boundaries and asserting dominance. Others would arrive as victims, hoping someone would finally stand up for them. Either way, they would encounter a teacher who understood that true strength isn't about size or aggression. It's about having the skills and confidence to protect what matters, while maintaining your principles. And sometimes, that's the most powerful lesson of all. The story of the art teacher who faced down the campus bully would become part of Millbrook legend, inspiring countless others to find their own courage. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stand their ground to change everything. 3 years later, Cassidy stood before a packed auditorium at the Texas Community College Association's annual conference, delivering the keynote address on creating safe learning environments through confident leadership. The invitation had come after her innovative anti-bullying program became a model adopted by colleges across the state. The most important lesson I learned, she told the audience of educators, is that bullies aren't looking for fights, they're looking for victims. When you refuse to be a victim, you often find they don't know what to do next. In the front row sat Dr. Williams, now a firm supporter who had helped secure funding for Cassidy's expanded program. Behind him, she spotted several familiar faces, former students who had gone on to successful careers, many crediting their time in her classroom as a turning point. Sarah Mitchell, now a senior graphic designer at a prestigious Austin firm, had driven 3 hours to attend. After the presentation, she approached Cassidy with news that would have seemed impossible during that first semester. "You'll never guess who applied for an internship at our company," Sarah said with a knowing smile. Cassidy raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Troy Brennan. He's been working at his father's dealership, but apparently he's been taking online design courses. His portfolio was actually impressive." The revelation was stunning. Troy had reached out through Sarah specifically because he'd heard about Cassidy's reputation in the industry. His application essay included a lengthy apology for his behavior and an acknowledgement that his encounter with her had been the wake-up call I needed to become a better person. "Are you going to hire him?" Cassidy asked. "We're considering it. People can change. Right? You taught us that." That evening, Cassidy received an unexpected email. The subject line read, "Long overdue apology. Miss Harper, I know this is probably the last thing you expected to see in your inbox. I've been wanting to write this letter for 3 years but never had the courage until now. What happened in your classroom changed my life. Not just because you showed me I wasn't as tough as I thought, but because you showed me what real strength looks like. You could have humiliated me, reported me, or gotten me expelled. Instead, you handled the situation with grace and gave me a chance to learn from my mistakes. I've spent the last 3 years in therapy, working to understand why I felt the need to hurt others, to feel powerful. I've also been volunteering with at-risk youth, trying to help kids who are heading down the same path I was on. I know I can never undo the harm I caused, but I wanted you to know that your example has inspired me to try to be better. I'm applying for internships in graphic design because your class was the first time I ever felt genuinely challenged intellectually rather than just physically. Thank you for seeing potential in someone who didn't deserve it. Respectfully, Troy." Cassidy read the email 3 times, feeling a complex mix of emotions. The cynical part of her wondered if this was just another manipulation, but the tone felt genuinely different from the arrogant young man she'd known. She forwarded the email to Sifu Chen with a note. "Remember what you always said about fighting to protect rather than to destroy? I think I finally understand what you meant." His reply came within minutes. "The greatest victory is when your former enemy becomes your student. You have mastered more than just technique. You have mastered the way of the peaceful warrior." 6 months later, Cassidy found herself sitting across from Troy in a coffee shop near the community college. He looked different, older, more thoughtful. With none of the aggressive posturing she remembered, his request for a meeting had surprised her. But her curiosity had won out. "I wanted to tell you in person," he said quietly, "that I got the internship. Sarah Mitchell recommended me, but she said the final decision would depend on a reference from you." Cassidy studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulative bully she'd once known. Instead, she saw genuine nervousness and what appeared to be hard-earned humility. "Why should I recommend you?" she asked directly. Troy was quiet for a long moment. "Because you believed that people could change before I believed it myself. And because I want to use whatever talent I have to help create the kind of safe spaces you taught me were possible." 3 weeks later, Cassidy submitted a carefully worded reference letter that acknowledged Troy's past behavior while noting his apparent commitment to personal growth. Whether he would succeed remained to be seen. but everyone deserved a chance at redemption. As she sealed the envelope, Cassidy reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken since that first day in Studio B. She had come to Texas seeking peace, and instead found purpose. Sometimes the battles we least expect become the ones that define us most completely. The quiet strength she'd learned through Wing Chun had given her more than self-defense techniques. It had taught her that true power comes from knowing when to fight and when to show mercy. In Troy's case, perhaps mercy had been the more powerful choice after all. Remember, if this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed someone standing up to a bully? Have you found your own strength in an unexpected moment? Your experiences matter, and they might inspire someone else to find their courage when they need it most.